At a glittering charity gala, a woman in a wheelchair was treated like hired help by the wealthy guests around her. One man set his empty champagne glass into her hand. A woman ordered her to move a chair near the stage. Laughter followed as she tried to pass through the crowd. Not one person knew who she was. Only a widower named Benjamin Carter walked toward her. Instead of pity, he smiled and asked her to dance. Minutes later, when the host revealed her true identity, the entire room fell silent. Benjamin Carter had not worn a tuxedo in almost 4 years. The last time he had stood beside his wife at a fundraiser, much like this one, her hand resting on his arm, while she introduced him to people whose names he forgot the moment they were spoken. She had been the one who knew how to move through rooms like these. After the cancer took her, Benjamin had let the social parts of his life quietly fall away until all that remained was the work. He designed buildings now, and not much else. The drafting table asked nothing of him that he could not give. He had come to the Whitmore Gala only because the small architecture foundation he donated to each year had given him a seat at one of their tables, and declining had felt like more effort than attending. So he had pressed the tuxedo driven downtown and let a valet take his car. The ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel rose 3 stories above him, all gold light and cut crystal, the kind of luxury that announced itself before anyone said a word. Benjamin took a glass of water from a passing tray and stood near the wall content to watch rather than be seen. The crowd was exactly what he expected. Men with expensive watches laughing too loudly at their own remarks. Women in gowns that cost more than most people earned in a season, drifting between conversations with practiced ease. There was a particular sound. To a room like this, a hum of self-importance that never quite settled. Benjamin had spent enough years married to someone who belonged here to recognize the rhythm of it, and enough years alone since then to feel like a stranger inside it. He checked his watch and decided he would stay 1 hour no more. It was somewhere in that first hour that he noticed her. A woman in a deep navy gown seated in a wheelchair near the edge of the floor where the light from the chandeliers thinned into shadow. She was not old. There was a stillness to the way she held herself, a composure that did not match the way the people around her were behaving toward her. Benjamin watched a man in a gray suit cross in front of her, glance down, and without breaking his conversation, set his empty champagne glass directly into her open hand, as though she were a piece of furniture placed there for his convenience. The woman looked at the glass. She did not protest. She simply held it, her expression unreadable, and set it on a nearby ledge herself when no server appeared. A moment later, an older woman in emerald approached her, gestured impatiently toward the stage, and said something Benjamin could not hear. The seated woman shook her head slightly, but the woman in emerald only repeated herself, pointing at a chair, clearly expecting it to be moved. People assumed things about a person in a wheelchair at an event like this. They assumed she was staff. They assumed she was there to serve, to be useful, to be invisible until needed. Benjamin felt something tighten in his chest, an old and familiar discomfort. He knew what it was to be looked through. In the months after his wife died, he had become practiced at watching people decide he was not worth the effort of a real conversation, their eyes sliding off him toward someone livelier, someone whose grief did not make the room heavier. He had learned that the world had a way of sorting people into those who mattered and those who could be ignored, and that the sorting happened fast before anyone bothered to ask a single question. He set his water down and began to make his way across the floor. He had no plan, no clever opening line. He only knew that he could not keep standing against the wall while a woman a few feet away was treated like she did not exist. As he drew closer, he saw her try to move her chair through a knot of guests, and saw the guests fail to part for her, laughing among themselves, forcing her to wait at the edge of their circle, like someone asking permission to pass. One of them glanced down at her, and away again, the dismissal so casual it was almost worse than cruelty. "Excuse me," Benjamin said, stopping in front of her. The people around her looked up, mildly surprised that anyone had spoken at all. I don't think we've met. I'm Benjamin Carter." The woman regarded him for a moment, and he understood at once that she was deciding whether his kindness was genuine or whether it was its own kind of performance, the sort of attention that came wrapped in pity. He had seen that calculation before. He had made it himself on the receiving end of too many sympathetic smiles after the funeral. "Sophia," she said, finally offering her hand. Her grip was firm, certain. "It's a pleasant surprise to be introduced rather than instructed." Benjamin almost laughed at the dryness of it. "I noticed the gentleman who mistook you for a coat rack," he said. "I thought I'd try a different approach." Something shifted in her face, then the smallest loosening at the corner of her mouth. The guests who had been crowding her drifted off, having lost interest now that someone else had claimed her attention. For the first time since he had spotted her, the space around the woman in navy opened, and Benjamin pulled a chair from a nearby table and sat so that they were closer to the same height. He did not want to stand over her. He had spent too much of his life being talked down to in the months of his mourning to do it to anyone else. They talked. It surprised him how easily it came. She asked what he did, and when he told her he designed buildings, she leaned forward with what seemed like real interest, asking about the work itself rather than the prestige of it. She wanted to know what he thought made a space feel welcoming, whether a building could be beautiful and still fail the people who used it. It was the first conversation he'd had in years that did not feel like an exchange of polite noises. She listened the way people rarely did anymore, as though his answers might actually change something in her. "Most people here haven't said more than 10 words to me all evening," Sophia said, and there was no self-pity in it, only observation. They look at the chair, and they decide they already know everything they need to know. "They decide quickly," Benjamin agreed. "I've found that's usually a sign they're not paying attention." She studied him again, and this time the wariness had thinned. "You speak like someone who's been on the other side of that." He did not answer directly. He only said that he had learned a few things about being overlooked and left it there, and she seemed to understand that he was offering her the truth without asking her to carry the weight of it. Around them, the gala continued, the orchestra tuning between songs, the laughter rising and falling, the whole glittering machine of the evening turning without either of them. Benjamin realized he had forgotten to check his watch. The hour he had promised himself had come and gone. What Benjamin did not know, what no one in the ballroom seemed to know, was that the woman he had sat down beside owned the very floor beneath their feet. Sophia Whitmore was the chief executive of Whitmore Hospitality, the company whose name was carved into the marble above the hotel's entrance and printed on every program scattered across the tables. The gala was hers. The foundation it benefited was one she had built herself, and she had quietly funded the entire evening from her own accounts. She had arrived late and through a side entrance, avoiding the red carpet, and the photographers, partly out of habit and partly out of a tiredness she rarely admitted to. Years earlier, before the accident that had taken the use of her legs, she had been a fixture at events like these, recognizable, sought after. But she had stepped back from the public face of the company for a long while during her recovery, letting others stand at the podiums and shake the hands. Most of the guests tonight were new donors, charity circuit acquaintances, people who had never seen her face up close and would not have connected the woman near the wall with the name on the building. To them, she was simply a woman in a wheelchair who had wandered somewhere she did not belong. Sophia had grown used to it. That was the part she would have struggled to explain to anyone who had not lived it. The casual dismissals no longer shocked her. She had built an armor out of them, a way of moving through the world that expected very little, and was therefore rarely disappointed. She had stopped waiting for strangers to surprise her. And so the man who had crossed the floor, pulled up a chair, and asked her opinion on the nature of buildings had done something she had not anticipated. He had treated her as a person before he had any reason to. The orchestra finished tuning. A slow, warm melody began to fill the room, and couples started to drift toward the open floor at the center of the ballroom. Benjamin watched them gather the swirl of gowns and dark jackets under the chandeliers, and an idea formed in him that he almost dismissed as foolish. He looked back at Sophia, who was watching the dancers, with an expression he could not quite name, something between fondness and a distance she had taught herself to keep. "Would you dance with me?" Benjamin asked. For a moment she did not seem to believe she had heard him correctly. "I think you may have noticed," she said, glancing down at the chair, her voice carefully even, "that I don't dance anymore." "I noticed the chair," Benjamin said. "I didn't notice anything that meant you couldn't." He stood and held out his hand, unhurried, the way he might have offered it to anyone. "We'll find our own way to do it. I'm not much of a dancer either. My wife always led." The mention of his wife, spoken plainly and without weight, seemed to reach her. Sophia looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his face, searching it once more for the catch, the pity, the performance. She did not find it. What she found instead was a man who had decided for no reason that would benefit him that she was worth the gesture. She was aware, even as she considered it, of what saying yes would mean. For years, she had made herself small in rooms like this, choosing the edges, the shadows, the spaces where she would not be watched. To take his hand and move out under those chandeliers would be to do the opposite of everything she had trained herself to do. It would mean being seen fully and deliberately by every person who had spent the evening looking through her. They would stare. Some of them would whisper. She knew the precise shape of the judgment that waited for her out there on that floor. The other choice was the one she always made: to smile politely, to decline to remain where she was safe and unremarkable in the dim light at the room's edge. It would be the easy thing. It would be the familiar thing. No one would think any less of her, because no one was thinking of her at all. Benjamin's hand stayed where it was steady, asking nothing except that she decide. "You understand," Sophia said quietly, "that the moment we go out there, everyone in this room is going to look at us." "I'm counting on it being uncomfortable," Benjamin admitted. "But I've spent a long time avoiding rooms full of people, and it hasn't made me happier. I don't think it's made you happier either." She almost smiled at that, at the nerve of it, this stranger who had read her so quickly. Something in her that had gone quiet and careful over the long years of her recovery stirred against its restraints. She thought of all the evenings she had spent in shadow, all the times she had let the world decide she was finished simply because her legs were. She thought of how tired she was of agreeing with it. "All right," Sophia said, and placed her hand in his. "But you'll have to be patient with me. It's been a long time." Benjamin closed his fingers around hers. "It's been a long time for both of us," he said. He did not pull her or guide her with the awkward over-helpfulness she had endured from so many others. Instead, he asked her how she wanted to do this, and listened to her answer, and let her set the terms. She moved her chair out toward the floor under her own control, and Benjamin walked beside her, matching her pace, his hand still holding hers. The closer they came to the center, the more heads began to turn. He felt the room notice them, felt the curiosity ripple outward, the conversations faltering as people followed the strange sight with their eyes. Let them look, he thought. He had stopped caring what rooms like this thought of him the day he buried the only person whose opinion had ever truly mattered. And beside him, Sophia lifted her chin in a way she had not done in years, meeting the stairs as they came rather than shrinking from them. The music wrapped around them as they reached the open floor. The other couples had slowed. Some stepping back, all of them watching now. Benjamin lowered himself slightly, bringing his hand to rest lightly against hers, where it sat on the arm of the chair, and he began to move with her, a slow turning and improvised thing that belonged to no dance anyone could name. It was clumsy and unhurried, and entirely their own. For a few moments, Sophia forgot the eyes on her. She forgot the woman in emerald, and the man with the empty glass, and the long catalog of small humiliations the evening had handed her. There was only the music, and the man moving carefully in time with her, treating her not as a problem to be managed or a charity to be performed, but as a partner. She had not felt that in longer than she cared to count. What neither of them could see was how the room had begun to change around them. Phones had appeared. Faces that had been amused turned thoughtful, or uncertain, or quietly moved. Near the stage, a man in a charcoal suit watched the two of them with narrowed eyes, recognizing the woman in the wheelchair in a way the rest of the crowd did not. His expression hardening into something that was not admiration at all. And at the podium, the evening's host had begun to gather his notes, preparing to step to the microphone and welcome the room's attention back to the matter at hand, unaware that the name he was about to speak would turn the entire gala on its head. But all of that was a moment away still. For now there was only the music and the slow turning, and a man and a woman who had each spent years being looked through, finally deliberately allowing themselves to be seen. The song was still playing when the murmurs began. Benjamin felt them before he heard them clearly, the way a change in weather announces itself before the rain. The couples nearest to them had stopped dancing altogether, and the watching had taken on a different quality, no longer simple curiosity, but something sharper, a collective judgment forming in real time. He kept his attention on Sophia, on the slow, careful turning they had made their own, but he could not entirely shut out the words drifting from the edges of the floor. A man somewhere behind him said, not quietly enough, that he had to give the fellow credit for the theater of it, that there was always someone willing to make a show of compassion when there was an audience to admire him for it. A woman answered with a low laugh, agreeing that it was a touching little performance, and wondering aloud how long he would keep it up once the song ended and the cameras went away. The words were meant to be overheard. That was the whole point of them. Benjamin had expected discomfort. He had told himself walking out onto that floor that he was prepared for the room to stare. What he had not prepared for was the particular shape the cruelty took, the way it reached past him to land on Sophia, framing her, not as a person, but as a prop in a stranger's bid for attention. He saw her hear it. He saw the brief tightening at the corner of her eyes, the old armor sliding back into place over the thing that had begun for a few minutes to soften. "Don't listen to them," Benjamin said, low meant only for her. "I've had a great deal of practice not listening," Sophia answered. There was no tremor in her voice, but he had spent the evening learning to read the small things she allowed to show, and he understood the cost of the steadiness. "It isn't you they're laughing at. Not really. It's me. A man dancing with a woman in a chair is either a saint or a fool. They haven't decided which yet, but neither version is about who I actually am." He wanted to argue, but he knew she was right, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of disrespect. So he only held her hand a little more firmly and let the music carry them through the last of the song, the two of them refusing to stop, simply because the room had decided to make them a spectacle. Among the watchers, there were those whose reaction was softer, who looked at the pair with something closer to sympathy, and that was almost harder to bear. Benjamin caught the expressions of women dabbing at their eyes, of men nodding with the grave approval people reserve for charity, and he understood that to these onlookers, Sophia was a sad and lovely symbol, a chance for them to feel moved. They pitied her openly, and their pity was its own dismissal, a way of seeing the wheelchair and nothing else. Whether they mocked her or wept for her, the effect was the same. No one in the room was looking at the woman herself. The song ended. There was a scattering of uncertain applause, the kind a crowd gives when it is not sure what it has just witnessed. Benjamin straightened his hand still in hers, and for a moment the two of them simply held their ground at the center of the floor, while the room waited to see what they would do. Then the lights shifted toward the stage, and the evening's host stepped up to the microphone, tapping it once, drawing the attention away from the dancers and toward the podium. Daniel Brooks was a smooth, practiced presence, the sort of man hired to keep an evening like this moving. He thanked the guests for their generosity, made a light remark about the music, and then turned to the business of the night, the foundation, and the cause it served. Benjamin began to guide his chair back toward the edge of the floor, assuming the moment had passed, when Brooks said something that stopped him. "Before we continue," Brooks said warmly, "I'd like to recognize the woman who made all of this possible, the founder of our foundation and the chief executive of Whitmore Hospitality, whose hotel has so graciously hosted us tonight. Many of you may not have had the chance to meet her in person. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Miss Sophia Whitmore." A spotlight swung across the floor and came to rest on the woman in the navy gown. For one suspended moment, the entire ballroom was silent, the kind of silence that has weight, that presses on the skin. And then, the understanding moved through the crowd like a current face after face, turning toward the woman they had spent the evening ignoring, the woman one of them had handed an empty glass, the woman another had ordered to move a chair, the woman whose name was carved above the door they had all walked through. Benjamin watched the realization break across the room and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He looked down at Sophia, expecting to see triumph or vindication, or at the very least relief. He saw none of those things. He saw a woman bracing herself for what she already knew was coming. It came at once. The same guests who had laughed now arranged their features into admiration. The woman in emerald, who had ordered her to move a chair, pressed toward her, with a brilliant smile, gushing that she had not realized that it was such an honor, that she had so wanted to introduce herself all evening. The man who had set his empty glass into her hand appeared at her elbow with a fresh one, full this time, offering it with a deference so sudden it was almost obscene. People who had refused to part for her wheelchair now cleared a wide and reverent path. The transformation was total, and it took less than a minute. Benjamin had thought in the instant the spotlight found her that this might be a kind of justice, that the room would be shamed, that Sophia would be elevated, that the natural order would correct itself. But standing beside her, watching the tide of false warmth rush in, he understood that he had it wrong. There was no justice in this. There was only proof. "There it is," Sophia said. Her voice was very quiet, meant only for him beneath the swell of voices, clamoring for her attention. "An hour ago I was furniture. Now I'm the most important person in the room. Nothing about me changed in that minute, Benjamin. Not one thing. Only what they think I can do for them." He had no answer for her, because there was no answer. He watched her accept the compliments with a gracious smile that did not reach her eyes, watched her thank people for kindnesses they had not shown her, and he saw the loneliness of it more clearly than he had seen anything all night. The cruelty had been ugly, but the cruelty had at least been honest. This sudden flood of respect was something worse, because it confirmed the thing she had spent years suspecting, that her worth in a room like this had nothing to do with who she was, and everything to do with what she controlled, the part that hurts. She went on, her smile fixed in place for the crowd while she spoke only to him. "Isn't that they insulted me? I've been insulted before. It's that I'll never know now whether anyone here would have crossed that floor the way you did, before they knew. That door is closed. They've made sure of it." Benjamin understood then that the gift he had given her, the simple act of seeing her before he had any reason to, was a thing that could not be given twice and could not be faked after the fact. It was the one currency in that room that could not be bought, and she knew it, and so did he. It was perhaps the only honest thing that had happened to her all evening. The remainder of the gala blurred. Sophia was swept into a procession of introductions and photographs, the founder restored to her proper place, and Benjamin stepped back, unwilling to be folded into the spectacle. Before they parted, she found a moment to take his hand again, and asked plainly whether he would have dinner with her, some time that wasn't arranged around an audience. He said yes. It was the easiest yes he had given in years. He thought that might be the end of the difficulty. It was, in fact, only the beginning. The story did not stay inside the ballroom. By the following morning, it had escaped into the wider world, carried by the phones that had been raised during the dance. A clip of the two of them, turning slowly at the center of the floor, the woman in navy and the man in the dark tuxedo, had begun to spread across the city and then beyond it. The framing wrote itself. A lonely heiress in a wheelchair, ignored by her own guests, lifted out of obscurity by the kindness of a stranger. It was the kind of story people wanted to believe in, and for a day or two they did. Benjamin found himself the subject of an attention he had never asked for and did not know how to manage. His name appeared beside Sophia's in articles he had not agreed to his quiet life as an architect, suddenly recast as the backdrop to a fairy tale. For a brief stretch, he was celebrated, called a gentleman, held up as proof that decency still existed among the wealthy and the cold. But stories like that do not hold their shape for long, and the celebration curdled almost as quickly as it had risen. A new version of events began to circulate, sharper and more cynical, and it spread faster than the first, because cynicism always travels faster than wonder. The question that had been whispered on the dance floor, whether the man was a saint or a fool, found its answer in a third option that the public seemed to prefer. He was neither. He was an opportunist. The reasoning was simple and damning. Benjamin Carter was a struggling architect. The new accounts claimed a widower whose practice had grown quiet, who had appeared at the gala of one of the wealthiest women in the state, and singled her out the moment he laid eyes on her. He had not been moved by compassion. He had recognized Sophia Whitmore, known exactly who she was and what she was worth, and had performed his little act of gallantry directly into the cameras, calculating the entire time. The dance had not been kindness. It had been a man auditioning for a fortune. Benjamin read the first of these accounts standing in his kitchen, with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and the unfairness of it landed like a physical blow. He had not known who she was. That was the entire truth of it, the simple fact at the center of everything, and it was the one thing he could never prove. He could not reach back into that ballroom and show the world the moment he had decided to cross the floor, when she had been nothing to him but a person being treated badly. The proof lived only in his own memory, and memory persuaded no one. What troubled him most was not the damage to his name, though that came soon enough. It was the thought of what these stories would do to her. He understood with a sinking certainty that every accusation thrown at him would find its way to Sophia, and that it would land precisely on the wound she had shown him at the gala. She had told him that the cruelest part of the evening was never knowing who would have been kind before they knew her worth. Now the world was busy informing her that the one man who had been kind had known all along. His instinct was confirmed sooner than he wanted. When he reached Sophia by phone, her voice had changed. The warmth that had grown between them over the course of that evening was still there, but it was guarded, now drawn back behind the old armor he had watched her wear. She did not accuse him. She was too fair for that. But he could hear the question she would not ask, the doubt that the stories had planted in her, and he understood that she could not help it any more than she could help breathing. "I want to believe you didn't know," Sophia told him. "I think I do believe it. But you have to understand what it means to be me, Benjamin. Everyone who has ever come close has wanted something. My father's friends, the men who courted me before the accident, half the people on my own board. I learned a long time ago that the safest thing to assume about a kindness is that it has a price I haven't been shown yet." "There's no price," Benjamin said. "I didn't know who you were. I'd say it under oath if it would help." "I know," she said, "and I hate that a part of me still has to wonder. That's what they've done. They've taken the one clean thing that happened to me and made me suspicious of it." Her voice was steady, but he heard the grief beneath it, the exhaustion of a woman forced once again to question whether she was loved for herself or for her holdings. The damage spread outward from there, touching the parts of their lives the public never saw. Benjamin had been a finalist for a major commission, a cultural center, that would have been the most significant project of his career, the kind of work he had given up nearly everything else to pursue. Within the week, word reached him that the selection committee had grown uneasy. The firm did not want the distraction. They did not want their building associated with a man who was being called a fortune hunter in the press, regardless of whether the charge was true. The commission went to someone else. Years of work evaporated over a story he had no part in writing, and Sophia faced something worse. The man in the charcoal suit who had watched the dance with narrowed eyes had not forgotten what he had seen. Gregory Vance sat on the board of Whitmore Hospitality, a long-time presence in the company, who had never reconciled himself to taking direction from a woman he privately considered diminished by her injury. He had wanted the chief executive's chair for years and had been waiting patiently for an opening. The scandal handed it to him. Vance moved quickly, and with the appearance of reluctance, which made him more dangerous. He went to the other board members not as a rival, but as a concerned colleague, troubled, he said, by what the gala had revealed. Their chief executive had made a spectacle of herself, had let personal sentiment turn a serious fundraising event into tabloid material, had attached the company's name to a sordid little romance now playing out in the gossip pages. Was this, he asked, the judgment they wanted steering the company? Was she letting her loneliness, her circumstances cloud the discipline the role demanded? It was a cruel argument, and an effective one, because it dressed an old prejudice in the language of fiduciary duty. Vance never said the word that sat beneath all of it, never pointed openly at the wheelchair. He did not have to. He let the board fill in the blank, themselves. Let them wonder quietly whether a woman in her condition had the strength for the fight ahead. And within days, he had gathered enough support to call for a vote on her leadership. So they arrived, the two of them, at the same place from opposite directions. Benjamin had lost the work that gave his solitary life its meaning. Sophia stood to lose the company that bore her name, the thing she had rebuilt herself around after the accident took so much else. A single dance offered in good faith on a crowded floor had cost each of them the thing they could least afford to lose, and the worst of it had not yet come. The vote was set for the end of the month in the same building where Sophia had spent the better part of a decade rebuilding both the company and herself. Gregory Vance had done his work carefully. He had spoken to each board member in private, framing his ambition as concern. And by the time the date was fixed, the outcome was no longer certain in the way it once would have been. Sophia had counted votes her whole career. She counted them now alone in her office late at night, and did not like the arithmetic. She did not call Benjamin to ask for help. That was the part he came to understand only later. She had decided somewhere in the long days after the gala that she would not drag him further into a fire she believed she had started simply by accepting his hand. Whatever the two of them might have become, she was not willing to purchase her own rescue at the cost of what little remained of his reputation. So she prepared to face the board the way she had faced everything since the accident, by refusing to let anyone see how heavily it weighed on her. Benjamin, for his part, was carrying a weight of his own, and it was not the loss of the commission. A reporter had contacted him 3 days after that work slipped away, a woman who wrote for one of the outlets that had been feeding the story. She had been pleasant, almost sympathetic, and she had made him an offer that she clearly expected him to take. There were people willing to pay, and pay well, for his account of the night and the weeks that followed. An exclusive, the struggling architect side of the fairy tale, in his own words. What made the offer dangerous was not the money, though the money would have erased the hole the lost commission had torn in his finances. It was what the reporter let slip about the kind of story they wanted. They did not want him to defend himself. They wanted him to confirm the worst version of events, or failing that to hand over something usable about Sophia, some detail from their conversations, some private vulnerability she had shown him that could be shaped into a headline. He understood, listening to the reporter's careful phrasing, that she was not interested in the truth. She was interested in whatever would sell, and the truth that Benjamin had simply been kind to a stranger was worth nothing at all. He had things he could have given them. That was the temptation, and he was honest enough with himself not to pretend it was easy. Sophia had spoken to him candidly in the days after the gala had told him about the board, about Vance, about her fear that she would lose the company. She had told him in a moment of trust that she sometimes wondered whether she had the strength to keep fighting for a chair that so many people seemed to think she had no right to occupy. Any one of those confidences sold to the right outlet at the right moment would have been devastating. It would also very likely have salvaged his name. The public loved nothing more than a man who turned out to be telling the truth, and the reporter had as much as promised to frame him sympathetically if he gave them something in return. Benjamin sat with the offer for 2 days. He did not tell Sophia about it, because telling her would have felt like asking for credit for a thing he had not yet decided to do. He walked through his quiet house and thought about the cultural center he would never build, about the years of careful work that had come to nothing, about how close he was to being able to begin again if he simply said yes. And then he thought about the look on Sophia's face when the spotlight had found her, the particular grief of a woman who would never again know whether a kindness was real. He understood that there was a version of himself who would take the money, and that this version would be able to construct a perfectly reasonable defense of the choice. He had not asked for any of this. He owed the press nothing. He owed Sophia nothing beyond one dance and a few honest conversations. The world had already decided he was an opportunist, and there was a bitter logic to becoming the thing they had already named him. No one would be surprised. Some would say he had been a fool not to do it sooner, but Benjamin had spent 4 years learning what it costs to be looked through, and he had crossed a crowded ballroom precisely because he could not stand to watch it happen to someone else. To sell Sophia now to take the trust she had handed him and turn it into currency would make every accusation true in retrospect. It would prove that the cynics had been right about him all along, not on the night of the gala, but now in the choice he was being given. The kindness on the dance floor would become a lie told before its time. He found that he could not do it. Not because of what it would cost her, though that mattered, but because of what it would make him. He called the reporter back and declined. She seemed genuinely puzzled, as though refusing money to save oneself were a thing she had never encountered, and she asked him almost out of professional curiosity why he wouldn't simply tell his side. Benjamin told her that he intended to tell his side. He just did not intend to sell it, and he did not intend to tell it in a way that cost Sophia anything. Then he hung up, and he sat for a long while in the dark, and he understood that he had just closed the last door that might have led back to the life he had been trying to rebuild. The vote came 2 days later. Benjamin had no standing to be in the room, and Sophia had not asked him to come, but he went to the building anyway, and waited in the lobby, because waiting somewhere else had become unbearable. He did not yet know what he meant to do. He only knew that he could no longer sit at home while she faced Vance alone. What he had not planned, what came to him, only as he stood in that marble lobby, watching reporters gather outside the doors, was the realization that the same press that had ruined him was the one tool he had left. They wanted a statement. They had wanted his words badly enough to offer him money for them. He had refused to sell those words for his own benefit. But there was nothing stopping him from giving them away freely for hers. When the reporters noticed him, they swarmed, and the questions came fast and overlapping, all of them circling the same accusation, all of them wanting to know whether he had targeted Sophia Whitmore for her fortune. Benjamin let them shout themselves out, and then he said clearly enough that every recorder in the crowd would catch it, that he would answer the question they kept asking. The lobby quieted. He had their full attention the way Sophia had once had the room's, and he understood the strange power of being for a moment the person everyone had decided to listen to. "I didn't know who she was," Benjamin said. "When I walked across that floor, I had never heard the name Sophia Whitmore. I didn't know she owned the building. I didn't know she'd funded the evening. I knew one thing, and it was the only thing that mattered to me. She was the one person in that room being treated like she didn't deserve to be there. And I had spent enough of my own life being treated that way to know how it feels." I asked her to dance because everyone else was looking through her, and I couldn't. A reporter pressed him, asking why anyone should believe a man who stood to gain a fortune. Benjamin almost smiled at that, because the answer had arrived in his life only days before, perfectly timed. He told them that one of their own colleagues had offered him a great deal of money to tell a different story, to confirm the version they all preferred, or to hand over something damaging about Sophia herself. He told them he had turned it down. "A man hunting a fortune," he said, "does not refuse the easiest money he has ever been offered." He had walked away from it because the truth was not for sale, and because the woman they were all so eager to tear down had done nothing to deserve any of it, except be kind to him on a night when no one was kind to her. The thing about the truth, when it is spoken plainly by someone with nothing left to gain, is that it carries a weight that no clever argument can match. The reporters had come for a scandal and been handed a confession of decency instead, and they did not quite know what to do with it. The clip of Benjamin in the lobby spread as quickly as the dance had, but it spread differently. The public had been so certain of his calculation that the revelation of his refusal hit them as a genuine surprise, and surprise has a way of forcing people to reconsider. The narrative began to turn. Slowly at first, and then all at once, the man who had been called an opportunist was re-examined as something the cynics had decided no longer existed. Inside the boardroom, Sophia knew nothing of what was happening below. She had walked into the meeting prepared to lose, and she had decided that if she was going to lose, she would do it without flinching. Vance presented his case with the same studied reluctance he had used on each of them privately, painting her as a woman who had let sentiment and circumstance compromise her judgment, gesturing at the scandal as proof, never once saying aloud the prejudice that powered all of it. He asked the board to act in the company's interest. He was very nearly persuasive. What undid him was not Sophia's defense, though she gave one steady and unsparing. It was the world outside the room catching up to the world inside it. As the board moved toward the vote, the story of Benjamin's refusal had already reached their phones, the offer he had turned down, the words he had spoken in the lobby, the accusation that Vance had built his entire case upon the sordid romance, the fortune hunter, the spectacle dissolved in real time. The man Vance had used to discredit her had just refused a fortune to defend her in public with nothing to gain. The scandal Vance needed was no longer a scandal. It was a love story the public had decided to believe in after all. When the vote was counted, Sophia kept her chair. The members who had wavered came back to her, some of them with the slightly shamed expressions of people who had nearly made a serious mistake. Vance's campaign collapsed under its own weight, his concern revealed as the ambition it had always been, and the position he had spent years maneuvering toward moved further out of his reach than it had ever been. He left the meeting having lost not only the vote, but the trust of the people he had tried to turn. Sophia did not gloat. She had spent too long being underestimated to take pleasure in watching it happen to anyone else, even him. She found Benjamin in the lobby afterward, the reporters finally thinning out, and for a moment, the two of them simply looked at each other across the marble floor, the same distance he had once crossed in a ballroom. She had heard by then what he had done. She knew about the offer he had refused, and the words he had spoken, and she understood that he had been given the chance to save himself at her expense, and had chosen instead to spend the last of his own standing on her behalf. "You could have taken the money," Sophia said as he came toward her. "It would have been the smart thing, No one would have blamed you. I would have blamed me, Benjamin answered, and it wouldn't have been true. I told you at the gala I didn't know who you were. I wasn't going to let them turn that into a lie just because it was the expensive truth to keep. She looked at him for a long moment, and the wariness he had watched her wear since the night of the dance finally loosened and let go. The world had spent weeks trying to convince her that the one clean thing that had happened to her was a fraud, and he had just proven at a cost she fully understood that it was not. It was the answer to the question she had told him could never be answered, the question of who would have been kind before they knew. He had answered it twice now, once on the floor when she was nobody to him, and again in the lobby when telling the truth could only hurt him. What grew between them after that did not arrive as a sudden thing. They had both lived long enough and lost enough to be suspicious of anything that came too fast. It grew the way trust grows between people who have seen each other tested slowly through quiet dinners that no longer had to be defended from an audience, through the ordinary work of two careful people deciding to be less careful with each other. He understood her armor and did not ask her to remove it before she was ready. She came to understand that his kindness was not a performance, but simply the shape of who he was, and that it had cost him to keep it. A year later, they appeared together in public again, this time at the opening of a new Whitmore hotel, one Benjamin himself had designed. It had been built from the ground, up to a standard of accessibility the industry had long treated as an afterthought. Every threshold and entrance and corridor shaped around the simple conviction that no one who entered should ever be made to feel like a problem to be managed. The cultural center had been taken from him. This he had built instead, and it was better because it meant something. There were cameras at the opening, as there had been at the gala, but the looking was different now. No one regarded Sophia with pity as she moved through the rooms she had commissioned, because pity could not survive contact with a woman so plainly in command of her own life. No one looked at Benjamin with suspicion because the question of his motives had been answered in the most public way a question can be. They were seen, the two of them, as what they actually were, rather than as the symbols the world had once tried to make of them. Somewhere in the crowd, a guest remarked to another that it was a remarkable thing what the two of them had been through, and wondered aloud what the real lesson of it was. The answer was not complicated, though it had taken a gala, a scandal, and a vote to make it plain. The worth of a person was never in how they looked, or how they moved, or what they owned. It was in how they treated others before they knew who those others were. That was the only measure that told the truth, because it was the only one taken when no one had anything to gain. Benjamin had passed it without knowing he was being tested, and in the end, that was the whole of it.